Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Talking Feds one-on-one. So there's a fact that's emerged of late that has, I would say, is both, interesting and important as a matter of psychology, as a matter of economics, and perhaps more than anything, as a matter of politics, because it really seems to be exercising a fair bit of force in the coming election. And I'll let our guest, who's written about it, explain. When I saw his article in the Atlantic, I thought, here's something I'd really like to try to delve into a bit. So we're very glad to be with Rogé Karma, who is a staff writer at the Atlantic. He covers economics and economic policy. He was previously the senior editor of the Ezra Klein Show at the New York Times, which I gotta say is the gold standard in the podcast industry. So if you've noticed it going downhill in the last few months, well, I'll leave it to you to think about. Anyway, Rogé, thank you very much for being here. The piece is in the Atlantic. Tell us a little bit about what the topic and the kind of divide that you explore.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Harry. I really appreciate it. The premise of the piece is probably described by the headline. What would it take to convince Americans that the economy is fine? And the way I opened the piece is with this question. What do you think is the worst moment for people's perceptions of the economy in the last 50 years? We have consumer sentiment data going back to the 1970s. So what do you think it is? And one guess might be the last months of the 1970s. We had the stagflation crisis. We had multiple oil crises. We had living standards lower than they were at the beginning of the decade. It was a really tough time. You might think it was the financial crisis and the Great Recession, or when 20 million people lost their jobs at the beginning of the pandemic. And all of those would be great guesses, and all of them would be wrong, wrong, wrong. Because the moment where we had the lowest consumer sentiment going back to the 1970s was June 2022. And if you remember, that was a moment when you had inflation reach its peak of 9%. Russia had recently invaded Ukraine, sending gas prices to over $5 a gallon. There was a lot of uncertainty. People thought a recession was imminent. By no means was that moment worse than any of those other moments that I just described. But at least some of that pessimism was explainable. You could understand where it came from. And then over the next 18 months, and really over the course of 2023, inflation plummets from that 9% figure all the way down to near its pre-pandemic levels. GDP starts booming at a pace that it hasn't in decades, the fastest in the G7. You also have inflation-adjusted wages going up really quickly. You have the stock market booming. You have unemployment at its lowest level, at its below 4% for its longest stretch in 50 years. And yet, Americans keep giving the economy the kind of approval ratings usually reserved for divorce lawyers and polygamy. It's crazy.
I mean, it's true. And by the way, it's also job growth. And it's also, we find out just today, the U.S. numbers are totally blowing Europe out of the water in terms of our growth. I was actually just reading in preparation for this. Since the end of 2019, our economy is growing at about 8%, and the European Union about 3%, Japan 1%, Britain not at all. But it's not simply, so I want to delve into it. The sour mood since 2002 has abided, and it's conjoined, and I'll bring in the political part of this now, with a conviction that 4 years ago or more under Trump, the economy, in fact, then was healthy and robust, and that was a time, in fact, of negative job growth. Well, I'll leave it to you. So it's not simply a disconnect about where we are now, but where we've been in the recent past. Yeah. Now, let me just start here. Is this bleak look in contrast to the facts? Is that singular as far as you can tell since the 70s? Is there a moment of similar disconnect, or is that a thoroughly contemporary phenomenon?
It's a great question. And actually, the reason there's been so much uproar about this is because for most of US history, and especially really since the 1970s when we started tracking this, consumer sentiment has tracked pretty closely with indicators like GDP, unemployment, inflation. It's only recently that this divergence started opening up. In the past,
What's recently here?
as in 2021. Really, it's really the Biden, over the course of the Biden presidency, and really since inflation started taking off. And it's interesting because, again, like you had plenty of times when the economy was really negative and consumer sentiment was negative. You had time where consumer sentiment was great and the economy was great. It's just recently that you've had this divergence. And you asked whether this is rooted in reality. And I think the answer is both yes and no. It's complicated. On the one hand, I think that there is a real disconnect between what our headline numbers measure and what people actually experience on the other hand. So let's take an example. At The Atlantic, we commissioned a poll recently. We were looking at this disconnect. And so we asked people, when you're making up your mind about the national economy, what factors are you considering? And we were blown away because the number one answer by far was grocery prices. More than 60% of people put it in their top three. And yet, when you look at inflation indicators, inflation indexes, so when you read headline inflation numbers, they're an index made up of a bunch of different prices that are weighted by how much households spend on things. The average household spends less than a tenth of their budget on the supermarket. So food prices don't make up a huge portion of inflation. And in fact, a lot of measures of inflation don't even include food and energy at all. If you've ever heard of core inflation, these intentionally exclude food and energy. So you have these indicators on the one hand that are definitely telling us something, but they're not necessarily reflecting the prices that people care about most. And at the same time, a lot of the indicators we look at, they're measuring the rate of inflation. So the rate, when you see inflation has increased 3.2%, what that means is that that's how much prices have increased since the last year. But it doesn't mean that that's how much prices are today. If inflation is rising at 10% for a year and then suddenly goes down to 2%, that doesn't mean prices all of a sudden go down. Prices are still high, they're just not increasing as fast. And what you have is that prices are 20% higher today than they were in 2019. Grocery prices are 25% higher than they were in 2019. And so even as you have these headline inflation numbers coming down, you have a lot of things looking great. There still is something here where our headline numbers are missing something pretty important. I don't think that tells the whole story, but I definitely think that's part of it.
Yeah, no, it seems very interesting. It seems to tell a lot of it, a lot of one half of it, I would say,
Yeah.
because it is a power. I can understand, the average person just goes to the supermarket and gets sticker shock that now eggs have gone up 40%. You feel that in a kind of visceral way. I understand. And then when it's time for a car or a washing machine, whatever it is you pay, you don't have a deep sense of how it's changing or not. All that seems salient to me. What still seems a mystery, though, is the disjunction, if it indeed is a disjunction, between that sentiment now and that sentiment, unless we're in a time where, and I don't think we are, where grocery prices are particularly and disproportionately out of whack with other measures of inflation in the economy, then we still have this tricky question. Is it a Trump thing? Is it a general change in the sort of American people that they have this glum assessment driven by whatever that is so out of whack with the facts on the ground?
I'm glad you bring up that there's still a disjunction. And let me just put some numbers to this. So everything I just said about grocery prices is true. And yet there are some things that doesn't explain. So when you ask people about the national economy and then you ask them about their local economy, people are twice as positive about their local economies as they are about the national economy. You ask people in some polls about their personal finances. And you have this Quinnipiac poll that Quinnipiac is doing some polling in swing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. And they had this one for Michigan lately where they asked people about how their personal finances were doing. And 63% said they were mostly positive or excellent or good, as opposed to around 38% who said they were not good or bad. And then you ask people about the national economy and it flips. It's about 65-35. And so you have these mysteries. So wait a minute. If it's all grocery prices, if people are all upset, then why are they saying that their local economies are better, that their personal finances are better than the national economy? It doesn't explain that. And I think there are a few answers here. One of them is that we increasingly in our polarized age view the economy through our partisan blinders, right?
Yeah, I think now we're really zeroing in on what seems like a big part of the explanation. So yeah,
No, and I would ask you that you're like what actually fundamentally changed about the economy between January 19th and January 20th, 2021? The answer is nothing. And yet you see Republican consumer sentiment plummet on that day. Why? Joe Biden was inaugurated on that day. And so nothing changed about the economy. And the same thing, although to a less extent, happened for Democrats when Donald Trump entered office. For both parties, there is a tendency going back to at least the Obama presidency of people thinking that the economy is far worse when the other side is in office. I will note this is not a symmetrical phenomenon. So Republicans are about 2.5 times more down on the economy when a Democrat is in office than when the opposite is true, but it still holds for both parties. And so I think partisanship is a big part of it. It also, I think, is identitarian in another way. I think for Republicans, it's a lot to do with the fact that Joe Biden is in office. I think for Democrats, there's been this shift over the last decade where I think there's been a movement, especially among younger Democrats, towards a more systemic critique of the economy. So if you look at Democrats aged 18 to 34, their views of capitalism plummeted during the 2010s from about 56% approval of capitalism in 2010 to about 40% in 2019. That's the same group of Democrats, younger, more progressive Democrats, that's still the most negative about this economy. And so for Republicans, I think this has a lot to do with the fact Joe Biden is in office and it goes against your partisan identity to admit the economy is doing well. And for Democrats, especially younger Democrats, I think it cuts against the very modern progressive sense of self to suddenly admit that maybe the economy is doing better than we think it is.
yeah, that seems very trenchant to me. There's a kind of increased native sourness. You can imagine it in political terms. It is the case that Trump just objectively has a kind of an apocalyptic view of America as going to shit in 18 different ways. And that is something new and different that you can see people seizing on. So that I can't think of a better explanation for the disjunction. And of course, that's got real implications. You have Biden with very robust numbers, but Jimmy Carter kind of impressions. And how do you sort of bust out of that? Let me put it. Let me ask in this way. Is there any kind of maybe slower lagging or always slightly depressed relationship between the facts and reality, such that the nadir, as you identified it in the actual fairly high point in inflation, especially groceries, I would add to that gasoline. You go recently and holy cow, and I live in California and $6, et cetera. Is there some sense that, okay, well, now it's been about 2 years, it just takes a little bit while, but people will sort of see the facts or kind of see the disconnect between saying everything's fine here, but out there it's kind of bad? Or does it seem native and identitarian, as you say, such that, and I know this isn't, Rogé, where your ballywick or where the point of attack of the article, but if that's the case, then you wouldn't think it's a problem that could be solved just by people coming to have more time between them and the bad news, and they could little by little come to appreciate where things stand. But if it's a flat out, I like Trump, therefore economy sucks, we think that wouldn't change between now and November. Is that a cogent question? Or do you see what I'm asking?
I think that is the exact right framing, right? There are really two theories of what's going on. One is it's the prices, it's the grocery prices in particular, And two is it's this bundle of non-economic factors. And if it's the former, if it's prices, those should adjust. So the joke I make in the piece is that my great grandmother used to reminisce about when a can of Coke costs a nickel. But she doesn't think that the economy is in the tank just because she has to pay $1 or more for the same beverage.
Right,
Right?
right.
People adjust to higher prices. And there was this great analysis by two Stanford economists looking at inflation over history and finding that it usually takes about 18 to 24 months for inflation going down for that to fully show up in consumer sentiment. It just so happens that about 18 months after the peak of inflation, which was in June 22, in December 2023, about 18 months later, all of a sudden we saw consumer sentiment start to rise a lot. Between December and January of 23 and 24, what we saw was the highest surge in consumer sentiment in 30 years, the highest 2-month surge in 30 years. So all of a sudden it shot up. Okay, maybe it is because people are finally getting used to prices and realizing the economy is not so bad. If so, that's one possibility. But still, February we saw it sort of stagnate consumer sentiment. It's still well below where it was when Biden took office, well, even farther below when Obama was in office and Trump. And so there really still is this question, how much of it is prices, which as people continue to adjust to lower prices, as people start to realize their wages are outpacing inflation, people should get more positive about the economy. At the same time, I really do think there are these structural factors that are holding it down, and it's really going to depend on, I don't pretend like I know or have the answer. I think the other concerning thing is that even as consumer sentiment has rebounded, Joe Biden's approval rating hasn't. So you saw this surge in consumer sentiment, and you didn't see a subsequent surge in Biden's approval rating. That isn't necessarily like the ultimate warning sign. Both Obama and Trump had a disconnect between their approval rating and how the economy was doing. And in both cases, the economic fundamentals still was predictive of election outcomes in 2012 and 2020. But still, it's concerning that people are thinking the economy is a lot better, but they're not so much more positive about Joe Biden.
I want to make sure I just heard what you said accurately. So the better, and of course, I always find these predictive models somewhat suspect because they're based on 10 elections at tops or whatever. But I just heard you accurately to say, did I, that economic fundamentals, the true and actual state of the economy is a better predictor of electoral results than consumer sentiment about the economy. Is that accurate?
So, generally, consumer sentiment, the three indicators that political science usually look at are just GDP, income growth, and consumer sentiment. Generally, all three are pretty much in the ballpark. But for example, in 2020, the polls were something like 8 points off. Consumer sentiment, if you just looked at the relationship between consumer sentiment and presidential outcomes and then extrapolated that to 2020, that was about 5 points off of the actual outcome. And GDP growth was only about 2 points off. So actually, GDP and some more fundamental economic indicators were much more predictive of the 2020 election than consumer sentiment, despite the fact that that was a very weird year economically. Like that was a very, we had, again, a shutdown, we had police protests, we had a uniquely polarizing president, and still the economic fundamentals predicted that election's outcomes pretty closely. And so it's difficult. I would say the thing I would rest my laurels on more is the saying that both consumer sentiment and economic fundamentals tend to correlate more closely with election outcomes than they do with presidential approval. For some reason, when people are thinking about whether they approve or not of the president, that has been disconnected recently from a lot of disconnected from consumer sentiment. But when it actually comes down to when people vote, they tend to be more linked. And so, at least in theory, we should see if consumer sentiment continues to increase, Biden should get some credit for it in number.
So yeah, the perennial question since Reagan, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Doesn't zero in on the president, which in a way makes sense. I don't know if people have incorporated this notion or taken it on board, but it does seem to me that the economists kind of teach us there's only so much a president actually does to affect the economy anyway. So it's always the sort of father or parent figure that's the president is somehow responsible for your economic well-being maybe seems flawed anyway.
I will say, Harry, I think the thing that frustrates the Biden administration right now is that they feel like some of their economic policies have really helped boost this economy. And I think that the most clear example of that, you cited those numbers from Europe earlier, right? Originally, when the Biden administration passed that $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan in March 2021, the view was this was going to lead to inflation. When inflation started taking off, that policy was largely blamed for setting off inflation. Now looking back, Europe didn't have that similar kind of stimulus, and inflation went even higher in Europe.
Right.
The difference, and in both places, inflation has come down. And the big difference is that the US economy is roaring, is booming, while Europe is on the brink between stagnation and recession, right? UK is in an outright recession. Europe as a continent grew by exactly 0% in the second half of last year, where the US economy grew extremely quickly. And so when the Biden administration's, I think, frustration comes is like, look, it turns out our policies gave people this excess savings that allowed them to keep spending through higher interest rates, through higher inflation. And if you just look across the Atlantic at Europe, it becomes obvious that those policies actually helped the economy, didn't hurt it. And so I think it's especially frustrating for them when people look
Yeah,
back
like
at that.
what's a guy got to do? And I'll add a kind of sensational piece of news, that's spanking new, which is I don't remember the last time this happened. Again, I'm not an economic expert, but real wage growth is up for the middle class for all but the top 20% of Americans. Every economic boom I remember in my lifetime has resulted in a even greater disparity between the uber rich and regular rich all the way down. And the Biden policies or Biden administration policies, however you want to put it, are actually delivering for the middle class. It's a a kind of stunning fact that
Mhm.
somehow doesn't seem to have penetrated the national consciousness.
The cynical version of me wonders if that is such a coincidence, Harry. Because, so for example,
That what's a coincidence? It's not people not knowing it, or that it's happened.
I don't know if it's a coincidence that the fact that you're right, this boom has actually been most felt by the bottom end and the middle of the income distribution. Actually, there was some recent economic research that found that the income inequality between the top 10% and the bottom 10% since the 1980s has been reduced by 40% just in the last couple of years alone because the wage growth at the bottom 10 has been so high.
Drop the banner. That seems
Yeah,
like enormous news to me. But anyway, go ahead.
you don't hear about it as much. It's incredible. Inflation adjusted wages for the middle class, the 40th to 60th percentile of earners, is almost 7% higher today than it was in December of 2019. So even adjusted for increased inflation, you are almost 10% richer. The middle class almost 10% richer than they were. The only group, as you said, that hasn't, they've still gotten wage gains, but not as much, is the upper class. But guess what? Who tends to be the people in media? Who tends to be the people who
I see. Oh,
shape our
very
economic
interesting.
discourse? That's why I say I don't know if it's a coincidence. I think at least there's some evidence that suggests there's been a real media bias towards increased economic negativity. And I wonder if part of that is because the people at the top have been feeling a lot of the inflation and haven't been feeling as many of the wage gains, which have been going to people with less of a voice in our discourse.
That's a really great and interesting point. Okay, so I mean, you've really unearthed some super interesting stuff, and I think the next many months will tell how kind of abiding the disconnect is, and the consequence. It's much more than of academic importance. The article is What Would It Take to Convince Americans That the U.S. Economy is Fine, as indeed it is. And Rogé Karma has written it. It's in the Current Atlantic, yeah?
Yes, the April issue.
April, so there you have it. Thanks so much for being with us and explaining this really important state of affairs.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.